Hey everyone, today we're going to be working through the steps to replacing your spring cassette here, which is in your arm device and allows you to retract your drive belt. And so the first step here, I would suggest, or you will need to, detach the end of your drive belt from your shaft and then weave it back through your pulley block. And so that will need to be loose. So a big step here is to make sure that you do not let this drive belt come loose at all and unwind your spring cassette. With your old spring cassette, it wouldn't necessarily matter as now you're going to be replacing it, but for safety purposes, we don't want this to spin out. With your new spring cassette, once this unwinds at any point, it'll lose all its tension that's wound up here and coiled with a spring, and you will need a replacement for that one. So just as a tip and reminder, so the first step to move on is we want to use our Allen key that comes with our unit, and we're going to release the drive belt from under the belt bite cylinder, again, without letting it unwind completely. So I want to keep a hand on it on either side. And once we get that through, all we need to do now is unwind the spring cassette here, opposite way you would for increasing pretension. And now we can let this go and just spin it enough so that you can take it off. Again here, this is the spring cassette that we would be replacing, so you don't necessarily need to keep this one from releasing, but again, just for safety purposes, we can let it unwind this way. Now, I have this unwinded, the spring cassette, and I just spun it out so that it doesn't have pre-tension or tension in the coil. And now we remove the top end of the housing unit here. And so with this, it clips under and through these pieces. So all you have to do really is rotate it along here, and it should lock like that. And you can pull on these tongs to release this top. And now what I'll do is take the old spring cassette off of the unit. And if you want to keep your drive belt, now we will unwind the drive belt completely off of this spring cassette and we will put it on our new one. If you have a new drive belt, you just follow the steps that I'll go through in the future here on the new spring cassette with your new drive belt. So once you have your drive belt unwinded, we have our new spring cassette here. And sort of similar to what we were just doing in reverse, we're going to want to hook our drive belt, our new drive belt, or the one you just had if it's still in good condition, onto this hook here, and you want to make sure that it's under and latched at this point. And so it wraps around kind of like this. And what we can do is wrap this all the way back around when we put, and then we'll put this back on here. As I'm winding this around, we want to make sure that the drive belt is pretty tightly wound around here, because as we put it back on the housing unit, if it's too loose, it might be too wide to fit within the space here like this. If it's pressing against the edges, what will happen is the auto retract won't work because it won't spin. So we want to make sure that we get this spun around and pretty tight. And so now I have our drive belt wound around the spring cassette fully on either end. And what we want to do is make sure that you have, there's a circle peg on one end and then there's a square peg on the other end of the spring key that's in the middle. We want to make sure this stays in this spot, as if you were to press this end out, it could release the coil that's wrapped and weaved through the slot here. And so while we're pushing this down, we want to apply some pressure here on this end and match the spring key with the square key with the square hole here. Sometimes you may have to kind of find where it notches in, but you could sort of check to see if this rotates at all if you have it in place. So once we have this in place, and you can see again that the peg doesn't spin or rotate because it's locked in on the other end, and this is our spring key. We'll put the housing unit back on, the top end of it, and you can see here that that hole should match up with the circular end of our spring key. And so we'll lock this in, and you could press down where it should be and make sure your drive belt and everything is in place. And I can unwind that here if you need a little bit more space. And press this down on all ends. And so, once that's locked in, we have this here, the drive belt. And what you want to do is make sure that no matter how it ends, your drive belt is coming out of this end, because it'll need to feed back through our belt bite cylinder and out and around or over the top of the unit. But first, with your new spring cassette, we're going to want to reset pre-tension, and you have instructions on the top piece that we just put back on, and it mentions rotate spring counterclockwise to increase pre-tension, and that's exactly what we're going to do with our new spring cassette here. But you can also do that with your older spring cassette if you have lost tension in it. But sometimes it completely unwinds, and we would need to replace as we are doing now. And so what I'm doing is weaving this through so I can grab the drive belt here and feed it through so I can rotate this like such. And we suggest spinning this counterclockwise around 12 to 15 times fully. And so we will do that now. And so once we have rotated the spring counterclockwise to increase pre-tension, again, around 10, 12, or 15 times, we suggest it within the range of 12 to 15. But again, once we pull this, it'll also rotate in that same direction, which will increase some pre-tension further. And so our next steps, without releasing the drive belt or letting it go, now that you have some pre-tension that's set, you should be able to feel it. We're going to make sure that the drive belt comes out of this end because it'll loop under our belt bite cylinder here. And so we want to make sure, without letting it go, using our Allen key to release our belt bite cylinder again. We want to feed the rest of the drive belt under the belt bite cylinder. With the Allen key, you release this here. And now, if I pull from this end and release as such, I can pull that through. And again, so you can see, just like this. So once we have the drive belt fed under the belt bite cylinder and it's holding where it needs to be, you want to feed the end of the drive belt through in the bottom of the chassis here. If you're working on it upside down and you have some space, you can kind of just do this. And from there, you'd flip it over, and we're going to weave it back through our pulley block and reattach it to our drive shaft here. And that's how you would replace your spring cassette.